Hello and welcome to Lessons in Crisis, a podcast in which we will delve into some of the lessons we have learned during a most recent crisis you may be familiar with, the COVID-19 pandemic. I am your host, Ashley Marcello, and in today's pilot episode, we will be reflecting on the psychosocial impacts and lessons learned from this unprecedented time in our lives. I'm sure a lot of us have pushed the thoughts of COVID-19 to the back of our minds, as many people have already transitioned back to their normal routines and back into a world where we can all enjoy each other's company in person again. But is everything really back to normal? And should it be back to normal? Let's unpack these challenges and what has become of the many changes during this crisis. Now, before we dive straight into this talk, it is important to acknowledge the influence that the COVID-19 pandemic has made on our world, our society, our communities, our families, and even on ourselves as individuals. During this difficult time, we lost loved ones, experienced illness, and had our perceptions of the world turned upside down as we did our best to make sense of this virus that has placed a hold on our regular routines or disrupted many of our everyday lives. It is also important to acknowledge the science that has allowed us ways to safely interact with one another and prevent us from becoming ill, as well as acknowledge all of the people who have shown resilience and fought for our health and our protection. Thank you to all the frontline workers and those who have provided us with resources and services to help keep us healthy. During many long months of isolation and attempts to quarantine, many of us have experienced our mental and physical health being challenged like never before, and the profound effects on our well-being continue to take up space in our lives, even without us knowing it. According to a study by the Kaiser Family Foundation, many adults experience anxiety and depression throughout the course of the pandemic, and approximately 4 in 10 adults were reporting these symptoms in the beginning of 2021, with many people still struggling to decreasing mental health and well-being. It may come as no surprise that many people experience anxiety and depression at heightened levels during and after this time, as people were coping with a variety of issues such as the loss of their loved ones and the consequences of a receding economy. A perspective sourced by Papas from the 15th volume of the Clinical Microbiology and Infection Journal says that anxiety extends beyond the physical consequences of infection, which supports the idea that while some of us viewed the first announcement of mandated quarantine as a break from some of our responsibilities, people experience mental health issues despite not contracting COVID-19. So the mental health issues during this pandemic is a public health crisis within itself. Some of the lessons we have learned from this pandemic, specifically those that involve our psychosocial ways of living, must be addressed in ways that will provide a consistent incorporation of these lessons into our lives after the peak of COVID. Many of these issues have existed long before this pandemic has even occurred, and after this devastating crisis we, as a whole, have lived through, you would think implementing these lessons would not be a debate. The COVID pandemic has only magnified the health disparities that have long existed in our communities, particularly racial and ethnic minority communities. Yale Medicine points out that the rates of hospitalization for COVID-19 were disproportionately higher for minorities than white people in every age group. This unequal treatment between these groups can be attributed to the higher levels of risk to disease that minorities have in comparison to their white counterparts, as many in-person essential jobs were worked by a majority of these minorities. During the beginning of COVID panic, schools were shut down and forced to take place virtually as online resources, such as Zoom, allowed for virtual classroom meetings. In his 2022 article, Larry Ferlazzo, an English and social studies teacher in Sacramento, California, made it a point that school district leaders should learn their lesson of creating a new normal, because during such a difficult time, especially during the peak of COVID, how could we expect our students to perform at their best when we are all trying to process what Ferlazzo mentions in his article as the tsunami of grief, loss, fear, and death that hit our world? The concept of hustle culture has become so prevalent in our society that even in the midst of a global emergency, the long period of isolation allowed us the moments to calm down, redirect ourselves, and reflect on what is most important in our lives besides feeding into this toxic culture consisting of a lack of empathy towards others. That brings us back to our question earlier. As we continue to make our transition back to normalcy post the COVID emergency, can we really go back to what we believed was normal before the rise of this pandemic? After everything we have been through these past 3 years, it is difficult to say the extent it will take to adjust to a new normal given the changes in our policies, behaviors, and our societal norms that resulted from this emergency. Considering the struggles we endured and the ways we tried to combat these challenges, it is important to shape a more progressive way of living using the lessons learned from this global crisis.